The 1960s produced some of the biggest names in music history. But fame in that era could turn on a dime. One bad decision, one embarrassing moment, one ill-timed reinvention, and an artist who had been untouchable could become a punchline almost overnight. These are 12 music stars from the 1960s that became jokes in seconds. Number 12. Bobby Rydell.
Forget him and please come home to me.
Bobby Rydell was one of the biggest teen idols in America. Between 1959 and 1963, he came out of South Philadelphia, the same neighborhood that produced Frankie Avalon and Fabian. And for a few years, he was right there alongside them at the top of the pop charts. Wild One reached number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100 in 1960. Volare reached number 4 the same year. Forget Him hit number 4 in 1963. He appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show multiple times, had his own television specials, and was the kind of act that teenage girls in the early 1960s genuinely screamed for. Then the Beatles arrived in February 1964, and the entire category of music Bobby Rydell represented, the well-groomed, management-approved, non-threatening teen idol, was rendered obsolete almost immediately. It wasn't anything Rydell did wrong. The market simply moved past him and the rest of the Philadelphia teen idol class in a matter of months. He continued performing on the Supper Club and Nostalgia circuit for decades, and he was good at it. A genuinely talented singer with real stage presence who understood how to work a room and keep an audience engaged long after the hit records had stopped coming. But to the generation that had grown up with him, he became a symbol of everything that the British invasion had swept away. The joke wasn't cruel so much as it was structural. He represented yesterday, and yesterday arrived very suddenly in early 1964. He tried updating his sound and his image through the mid-1960s without finding a way back to the charts, and eventually he stopped trying and simply became what the audience wanted him to be. A reminder of a sweeter, simpler moment in American pop history. Rydell died on April 5, 2022, in Philadelphia. He was 79 years old. The neighborhood he grew up in, and the era he represented, had a genuine warmth and a specific quality of American innocence that the 1960s didn't so much destroy as simply leave behind.
Forget him and please come home to me.
Number 11. Fabian. Fabian Fort was discovered at age 14 by a talent manager who spotted him sitting on a stoop in South Philadelphia and decided his looks were more important than whether he could sing. This was not an unusual calculation in the late 1950s pop industry, but Fabian became the most extreme example of it, an artist whose talent was openly questioned by critics, by industry insiders, and eventually by the public, and who became famous partly because of how openly that questioning was conducted.
I'm feeling stronger than a grizzly bear, soaring like an eagle flying.
He had genuine chart success. Tiger reached number 3 on the Billboard Hot 100 in 1959. Turn Me Loose reached number 9 the same year. He appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show and American Bandstand, and had a fan club that generated tens of thousands of letters a month. The machinery of teen idol promotion in the late 1950s was operating at full capacity on his behalf, and for a couple of years it worked.
I'm your tiger and you're my mate. Hurry up, buddy.
What made Fabian a joke, and kept him one, was the candor with which people in the industry described what they had done. Bob Marcucci, his manager, was remarkably open in interviews about the fact that Fabian's looks were the primary asset, and that significant work had gone into coaching and production to compensate for the limitations of his voice. That kind of honesty, which might have been refreshing in a different context, essentially confirmed every suspicion the public had about how manufactured the teen idol business was. Fabian transitioned into acting and had a reasonably successful run in films through the 1960s, appearing alongside John Wayne and Bing Crosby. It didn't change what his name had come to represent. He became shorthand for a certain kind of hollow commercial pop that the rock era was supposed to have replaced. Number 10. The Monkees. The Monkees were assembled in 1965. through an open casting call placed in Variety and The Hollywood Reporter by producers Bob Rafelson and Bert Schneider, who were developing a television series about a fictional rock band. The 4 members selected, Mickey Dolenz, Davy Jones, Michael Nesmith, and Peter Tork, were chosen primarily for their screen presence and personalities. Their music was initially produced entirely by professional studio musicians, with the Monkees contributing vocals and, in some cases, no instrumentation at all. The television series premiered on NBC in September 1966 and was immediately successful. The records that accompanied it, produced by Don Kirshner, who hired professional songwriters, including Goffin and King and Neil Diamond to supply the material, sold in enormous quantities. Last Train to Clarksville reached #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 in October 1966. I'm a Believer reached #1 in November 1966 and stayed there for 7 weeks. By any commercial measure, they were one of the biggest acts of 1966 and 1967. The joke arrived when the truth about how the records were made became public. In early 1967, journalist Sandy Gibson published details about the session musician situation, and the story spread rapidly. The Monkees were suddenly being described as a manufactured product rather than a real band, which was accurate, and which made all of the screaming fans who had treated them as equivalent to the Beatles feel retroactively foolish. The group fought back by demanding the right to play their own instruments and record their own music, which they did from 1967 onward, with genuine creative results. Their 1967 album Headquarters was recorded almost entirely by the 4 members themselves, and it was a credible record. Michael Nesmith in particular was a talented musician and songwriter who went on to a respected post-Monkees career in country rock. Peter Tork was a skilled multi-instrumentalist. The talent was real, even if the original setup had obscured it. But the fake band label attached to them early and never fully came off, regardless of what they did afterward. Decades later, the conversation about the Monkees still begins in the same place, with the casting call and the session musicians, before it gets to the music. Number 9. Lesley Gore.
It's my party and I'll cry if I want to cry if I want.
Lesley Gore was 16 years old when It's My Party reached #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 in June 1963. She recorded it under the production of Quincy Jones, who had signed her to Mercury Records after hearing her sing at a demo session. The record was a genuine pop achievement, a sharp, emotionally direct piece of teen drama that connected with an enormous audience. Judy's Turn to Cry, the follow-up, reached #5. She's a Fool reached #5. You Don't Own Me reached #2 in early 1964 and has been cited ever since as one of the early feminist statements in mainstream American pop.
Cry if I want to, cry if I want to.
The problem was timing. You Don't Own Me was released in December 1963 and reached its peak chart position in January 1964, 1 month before the Beatles' appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show. Within weeks, the entire landscape of popular music had shifted, and Lesley Gore's brand of well-produced teen pop was suddenly in the same position as Bobby Rydell's, technically proficient, commercially proven, and almost instantly dated. She continued recording and charting through the mid-1960s, but never recaptured the commercial ground she had held in 1963. The particular cruelty of her situation was that You Don't Own Me, the record that most clearly pointed toward something beyond the teen pop moment, arrived too late to benefit from the cultural shift it anticipated. Gore went on to study at Sarah Lawrence College, wrote songs for other artists, and came out publicly as a lesbian in the 2000s. She died on February 16, 2015, from lung cancer. She was 68 years old. Her reputation has been significantly reassessed in the decades since her death.
It's my party and I'll cry if I want to, cry if I want.
Number 8. Bobby Darin.
Could that someone be Mac the Knife?
Bobby Darin's transformation from rock and roll singer to Vegas-style entertainer and back again is one of the more bewildering career arcs of the 1960s, and it turned him into a figure that audiences found genuinely difficult to take seriously by the middle of the decade. He had been a genuine star. Splish Splash reached #3 on the Billboard Hot 100 in 1958. Mac the Knife reached number 1 in 1959, and won the Grammy Award for Record of the Year and Song of the Year. He was 23 years old, and Frank Sinatra had publicly said he thought Darin might surpass him. That was not a small endorsement.
Five will get you 10 old Monkees back in town.
But Darin couldn't decide what he wanted to be. He moved from rock to pop to jazz to folk, recording an album of Tim Hardin songs in 1966 that was critically praised and commercially ignored, and each reinvention left a portion of his existing audience behind without fully winning a new one. By the mid-1960s, he had grown a beard, started wearing jeans, and was presenting himself as a protest singer, in a way that struck observers as unconvincing given his previous incarnation as a tuxedoed Las Vegas entertainer. The press was not kind about it. The audience that had loved Mac the Knife found the new version of Bobby Darin confusing at best, and the audiences he was trying to reach with the folk material already had Bob Dylan and didn't need a converted Vegas act to make the same points. He died on December 20th, 1973, following open-heart surgery to repair a defective heart valve, a condition he had lived with since childhood rheumatic fever that had damaged his heart when he was a boy. He was 37 years old. The talent had always been real. The career simply never found a stable shape to contain it.
Could that someone be Mac the Knife?
Number 7. Chubby Checker. Chubby Checker's entire career rested on a dance craze that burned hot and then died. The Twist was released in 1960, reached number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100, was re-released in 1961, and reached number 1 again, making it one of the very few singles to reach the top of the chart twice on separate chart runs. For approximately 2 years, Chubby Checker was one of the most recognizable names in American popular music, appearing on American Bandstand and in films and doing television performances that reached enormous audiences. The problem was that everything he recorded was essentially a variation on the same formula. Pony Time reached number 1 in 1961. Let's Twist Again reached number 8. Limbo Rock reached number 2 in 1962. Each record was tied to a specific dance, and the dance was always the point. When the twist craze faded, and the limbo craze faded, and the pony craze faded, there was no artistic identity underneath them to fall back on. Checker had been marketed as a dance record specialist, rather than as a singer or musician with something to say. And when the dances stopped being culturally relevant, the records stopped being relevant with them. He continued performing and making records, and the question of royalties and credit, particularly his claim to have invented the twist, which was disputed by Hank Ballard, who recorded the original version of the song before Checker covered it, became an ongoing source of public argument that did not enhance his reputation. Ballard had written and recorded The Twist in 1958, and it had charted modestly before Dick Clark suggested Checker cover it for a younger audience. The credit dispute ran for years, with Ballard's contribution frequently overlooked in the official story Checker told about himself. By the mid-1960s, Chubby Checker had become a nostalgic act for a craze that had lasted less than 3 years. The speed of that transition, from the biggest dance record in the country to a symbol of a fad that had already passed, was remarkable even by the standards of an era that moved quickly. He has continued performing at oldies events and kept the twist alive as a live attraction, and audiences who remember 1961 respond to it warmly. But the critical establishment had written him off before the decade was half over, and that assessment stuck. Number 6. Herman's Hermits. Herman's Hermits were a Manchester group who had their first major success in 1964 with I'm Into Something Good, which reached number 1 in the United Kingdom and number 13 in the United States. By 1965, they were one of the most commercially successful British acts in America, with a run of hits that placed them second only to the Beatles in American chart performance for that year. The problem was the material. While the Beatles were evolving rapidly, from I Want to Hold Your Hand in 1964 to Rubber Soul at the end of 1965, Herman's Hermits were recording music that seemed deliberately designed to be as unthreatening and lightweight as possible. Mrs. Brown, You've Got a Lovely Daughter, reached number 1 in America in 1965. I'm Henry VIII, I Am, reached number 1 shortly after. Both were novelty songs, essentially, cheerful and catchy and entirely without artistic ambition. Peter Noone, the group's lead singer, was charming and photogenic and knew exactly how to work a television camera. Those qualities kept the hits coming through 1966 and into 1967. But as the decade's music grew more serious and more sophisticated, Herman's Hermits became a symbol of the most trivial end of the British invasion, the part that had been about cute boys and catchy choruses rather than anything more lasting. The American teen magazine audience moved on. The group's chart presence declined sharply after 1967, and by 1968 they were no longer a significant commercial force in either the UK or the US. Number 5, Paul Revere and the Raiders. Paul Revere and the Raiders were a Portland, Oregon group who signed with Columbia Records in 1963 and became regular fixtures on the American Bandstand television program before landing their own television showcase, Where the Action Is, a daily music program that ran on ABC from 1965 to 1967 and gave them extraordinary national exposure. They dressed in Revolutionary War costumes as a stage gimmick, which was entertaining in 1965 and increasingly difficult to sustain as a serious identity as the decade matured. They had real chart success. Kicks reached number 4 on the Billboard Hot 100 in 1966 and was a genuinely good record, a Mark Lindsay vocal with an anti-drug message that was harder-edged than most of what the group was known for. Hungry reached number 6 the same year. Him or Me, What's It Gonna Be, reached number 5 in 1967. The talent was real, and so were the records. What worked against them was the costume gimmick combined with the television overexposure. By 1967, appearing on a daily afternoon television program in tricorn hats was not compatible with being taken seriously in an era when the Beatles were releasing Sgt. Pepper, and the counterculture was redefining what popular music was supposed to look and sound like. They became associated with the most commercial and least countercultural end of 1960s pop, and the Revolutionary War costumes, which had seemed like clever branding in 1965, came to look faintly ridiculous against the backdrop of everything that was happening around them. Mark Lindsay, the group's lead singer, was a genuinely capable vocalist and had the look and charisma of someone who should have had a longer run at the top of the charts. He released solo material in the late 1960s and early 1970s that found some success, but the association with the costumed band and the afternoon television show followed him. Paul Revere himself continued leading versions of the Raiders on the oldies circuit for decades, keeping the name alive long after any of the original members were present. He died on October 4, 2014, in Garden Valley, Idaho. He was 76 years old. Number 4, Frankie Avalon.
Yes, Venus, goddess of love.
Frankie Avalon was one of the original South Philadelphia teen idols, and his trajectory in the 1960s followed the same arc as Bobby Rydell's and Fabian's. A sharp peak in the late 1950s and early 1960s, followed by the British invasion making the entire category irrelevant. Venus reached number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 in 1959 and stayed there for 5 weeks. Why reached number 1 in 1960. He was, for a brief period, one of the most successful pop acts in America. The 1960s, for Avalon, meant a pivot to film. He and Annette Funicello starred in a series of beach party movies, beginning with Beach Party in 1963, that were commercially successful and culturally significant in their own right. They defined a specific, sun-drenched image of early 1960s youth culture that has remained potent in nostalgia ever since. The films were not designed to be taken seriously, and they weren't. And that was fine, while they were culturally current. The problem was that the beach party films continued into the mid-1960s, past the point where they fit the cultural moment. And Avalon became permanently associated with a kind of cheerful, consequence-free teenage entertainment that the later 1960s found increasingly embarrassing. He has leaned into the nostalgia with considerable grace. His cameo in the 1978 film Grease was warmly received, but the transition from genuine pop star to nostalgic symbol happened faster for him than for almost anyone else in his generation.
Yes, Venus, goddess of love.
Number 3. Gerry and the Pacemakers. Gerry and the Pacemakers came out of Liverpool alongside the Beatles, managed by Brian Epstein and produced by George Martin at EMI. Their first 3 singles, How Do You Do It, I Like It, and You'll Never Walk Alone, all reached number 1 in the United Kingdom in 1963, making them the first act in British chart history to reach number 1 with their first 3 releases. That was a genuine record, and the group was one of the most promising acts in British pop at the moment the beat scene broke through. The difficulty was that the Beatles were on the same label, managed by the same person, and produced by the same producer. And the Beatles were becoming the most important rock group in history. Being from Liverpool and being associated with Brian Epstein was an enormous advantage in 1963. By 1965, it had become a double-edged association because every comparison led in one direction. Gerry Marsden was a talented singer and performer, and You'll Never Walk Alone became an enduring anthem adopted by Liverpool Football Club that has had a cultural life far beyond its chart origins. It is still sung at Anfield before every home match, which gives Marsden a legacy that most of his contemporaries would have envied. But the group's records stopped charting significantly after 1965, and the narrative of the also-rans from Liverpool, the ones who weren't the Beatles, attached to them and never entirely released its grip. Marsden himself was gracious about it in interviews over the years, acknowledging the impossible position of being part of the same scene as the most famous band in history and being judged perpetually by that comparison. He died on January 3, 2021. He was 78 years old. Number 2. Tommy Roe.
Sweet little Sheila, you know her if you see her.
Tommy Roe had one of the more unusual chart careers of the 1960s. Sheila reached number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 in September 1962 and established him as a significant pop act. He continued recording through the decade and had his biggest commercial moment in 1969, outside the 1960s proper, when Dizzy reached number 1 and stayed there for 4 weeks. The problem for Roe's reputation was the specific niche his music occupied. Sheila was a lightweight, bouncy pop record that drew direct comparisons to early Buddy Holly. The resemblance in style and production was audible enough that some reviewers simply called it derivative. The records he released through the mid-1960s stayed in the same sonic territory. And as the decade's music moved toward more serious and more adventurous territory, Roe remained cheerfully committed to a style of pop that an increasingly large portion of the critical audience found trivial.
Sweet little girl, that's my little Sheila Mandersley.
Dizzy, which was a massive commercial success in early 1969, was everything his critics had said he was. A pure bubblegum record with no artistic pretension whatsoever, constructed entirely to be catchy and disposable. It was catchy and disposable, and it sold millions of copies, and sat at number 1 for 4 weeks while the rest of popular music was trying to be something much more significant. The gap between what Roe was doing commercially and what was considered artistically credible in 1969 was enormous. And the success of Dizzy somehow made the credibility problem worse rather than better.
Sweet little Sheila, you know her if you see her.
Number 1. Freddy Cannon. Freddy Cannon had a run of genuine pop hits in the late 1950s and early 1960s that put him on American Bandstand more than any other performer of the era, a record he was proud of. And that said something real about how consistently his records connected with the teenage audience that the show served. Tallahassee Lassie reached number 6 on the Billboard Hot 100 in 1959. Way Down Yonder in New Orleans reached number 3 in 1960. Palisades Park reached number 3 in 1962. He had a specific sound, loud, fast, energetic, built around a production approach that used volume and momentum as selling points. That worked well on AM radio and on Dick Clark's television program. What Cannon never had was artistic credibility, and in the 1960s, that gap became increasingly difficult to sustain. His records were produced by Frank Slay and Bob Crew in a manner that was deliberately and unapologetically commercial, aimed squarely at the teenage market with no interest in saying anything beyond getting the listener to dance. That approach worked through 1962. After 1963, the same qualities that had made his records effective, the loudness, the simplicity, the uncomplicated energy, became the things critics and the more sophisticated end of the pop audience used to dismiss him. He continued recording through the 1960s without finding the chart success he had enjoyed in the earlier part of the decade. American Bandstand remained loyal to him. Clark had Cannon back on the show repeatedly even after his chart presence had faded, and the relationship with the show became both his primary promotional vehicle and, in some ways, a symbol of where he was stuck. American Bandstand by the mid-1960s had itself begun to look like a relic of an earlier pop era, and being its most frequent guest was not the commercial asset it had been in 1960. Cannon continued to perform on the oldies circuit for decades and has remained genuinely appreciative of the audience that stayed with him. The records he made are exactly what they were always advertised as: loud, fast, fun, and uninterested in being anything else. If this story stayed with you, hit the like button and subscribe. There are more stories like this one waiting.